He didn't lower his voice. That was the thing nobody talks about afterward. He didn't even try to be discreet about it. Damien Holloway walked into the Meridian Club on a Thursday evening in late October, the kind of evening where the sky had already gone dark by 5, and the cold came in fast off Lake Michigan. He was 31 years old. He wore a coat that hadn't been pressed and boots that needed resoling, and he carried a leather messenger bag, so worn at the corners that the stitching had started to separate. He had taken the 55 bus from the south side, same as he did every morning for work, and he had walked the last 4 blocks because he didn't want to spend the cab fare. The Meridian Club was not the kind of place people like Damien usually entered through the front door. He knew that. He'd known it his whole life, the way you know certain things without anyone ever having to explain them to you. The angle of a hostess's smile, that isn't quite a smile. The half-second pause before someone says, right this way, the almost imperceptible shift in the room when you walk through it. Damien Holloway had been navigating those pauses since he was 12 years old, when his mother used to take him to parent-teacher conferences at the private school where she cleaned the bathrooms, and the other parents would look at them both like they'd misread the address. He found the service entrance around the side of the building without being told where it was. Old habit. The banquet staff locker room was in the basement, past a corridor that smelled like industrial cleaner and old carpet. He changed into his uniform, white shirt, black pants, black vest, and tied his tie in the small mirror above the utility sink. The man reflected back at him looked like someone who had spent a lot of years learning to make himself presentable for rooms that didn't want him there. He had. His supervisor for the evening was a man named Carver, mid-50s, the kind of career banquet manager who communicated primarily through clipboard gestures and meaningful looks. Carver handed him a section assignment without making eye contact and told him the firm upstairs was hosting a private dinner for 12 international clients. Very important, don't linger. Damien took his station. He had been working banquet and private dining events for 3 years. 2 nights a week, sometimes 3 when the schedule allowed. During the day, he worked at a city planning office in the Loop, entry level, the kind of job that paid just enough to make you grateful and not quite enough to make you comfortable. The banquet work filled the gap. He didn't talk about it at the office. Not because he was ashamed of it. He wasn't, not anymore, but because he had learned that certain information, once shared, has a way of reorganizing how people see you, and he needed those people to see him clearly for the thing he was actually trying to do. What he was actually trying to do was finish his master's thesis in urban economics at the University of Chicago, which he was completing part-time, which he had been completing part-time for 2.5 years, which was due in 4 months, and which he had not told anyone at his day job about either. He was carrying a lot of silence, is what he's saying. The dinner upstairs was for a delegation from Hausler and Brecht, a German infrastructure consulting firm that had been circling a major contract with the city for the better part of 18 months. 12 people at the table, half of them from the firm's Stuttgart headquarters, half of them local stakeholders. The local stakeholders were the ones Damien recognized. 2 of them had been in meetings he'd sat in on, at the planning office, invisible in his usual corner chair with his notebook. He recognized them. They did not recognize him. This was not a surprise. He moved through the first hour of service without incident. Bread, water, salad course, wine pairings. He was good at this work, efficient, quiet, attuned to the rhythm of a table in a way that most people don't think about, because when it's done right, you don't notice it at all. He could tell from body language alone when someone needed a refill before they looked up, when a conversation was building towards something and he should not interrupt, when someone's wine glass was already full, but they were reaching for it out of nerves rather than thirst. He was reading the table the way he always did when the man at the head of it made the comment. His name, Damien would learn later from the event itinerary left on a side table, was Friedrich Bauer, senior partner. Early 60s, silver-haired, the kind of trim European executive who had probably run marathons for 40 years and wanted you to know it without saying so. He was speaking to the man on his right, one of his Stuttgart colleagues, and he was speaking in German. Rapid, fluid, confident German. Damien refilled the water glass of the woman 2 seats away and did not look up. What Friedrich Bauer said in German was approximately this, that the city's planning office sent its best and brightest to these Dinzers. Didn't it? Nodding in the direction of the 2 local stakeholders across the table. And then, not even dropping his voice, he said that the serving staff, however, seemed to have been selected on different criteria entirely. He said it with the particular amusement of a man who has never once considered that the person pouring his water might be listening. His colleague smiled. Damien set down the pitcher. He did not do anything else. Not yet. He moved to the next position, refilled the next glass, returned to his station at the side of the room. His face was exactly what it always was in these rooms. Neutral, professional, unhurried. The practiced blankness that isn't really blankness at all, but a very specific and deliberate stillness, the kind that takes years to develop and that people almost never correctly identify for what it is. What it is patience. He had learned German the way he'd learned most things, sideways, through a combination of stubbornness and circumstance that doesn't make for a clean story. His grandmother on his father's side had emigrated from Namibia in the early 1980s, and she had learned German as a colonial inheritance she'd never asked for and never quite forgiven, and she had passed it to Damien the way you pass things like that. Through proximity, through the radio programs she listened to, through the books she kept on the shelf in her apartment on the west side, through Sunday afternoons that smelled like tea and old paper, and something she never named directly but that Damien had come to understand as grief shaped into language. He spoke it the way he spoke most things, carefully, and better than anyone expected. He had also spent 14 months in Berlin on a Fulbright fellowship 6 years ago. Before the planning job, before the thesis, before the banquet work, back when his life had seemed briefly and terrifyingly open in all directions at once. He had studied urban housing policy at the Free University. He had made friends. He had lost touch with most of them, as you do. He still read German without thinking about it, the way you stop noticing the act of reading in your first language because it has become simply the act of understanding. He understood every word Friedrich Bauer said. All of it, including 20 minutes later, when the main course had been cleared and the conversation at the head of the table turned to the contract, and Friedrich Bauer said to his colleague, in German, that the city's counterpart on the infrastructure side seemed competent enough, but that the real decision-makers were almost certainly not in this room, and that they would need to push for a meeting with someone who actually had authority, because the people at these dinners, he said, were generally decorative. The 2 local stakeholders across from him smiled politely at something being said in English at the other end of the table. They hadn't understood a word. Damien had understood all of it. He stood at his station and waited. The moment came the way these moments always do, not dramatically but quietly, through a small logistical gap. One of the Stuttgart colleagues leaned forward and asked, in accented English, whether anyone at the table knew the details of the Riverside Corridor Amendment, a specific provision in the city's infrastructure code that had come up in negotiations, and that, apparently, no one on the local side had been able to clarify to the firm's satisfaction. The 2 local stakeholders looked at each other, the kind of look that means, do you know? Because I don't know. There was a pause, the kind of pause that has texture to it, the kind where people reach for their water glasses and study the centerpiece. Damien stepped forward, not to the table. He didn't do that. He stepped forward to the nearest stakeholder's elbow, the way you do when you're going to ask if they need anything, the way he'd done 100 times that evening already. He bent slightly, the professional lean, and he said quietly, in German, Entschuldigung. The Riverside Corridor Amendment in question was revised in March of last year. The amended provision affects parcels classified under Municipal Code 14-7 only when the project footprint exceeds 40,000 square feet and crosses a zoning boundary. The city's counterpart can confirm, but the short answer to Bauer's question is that the exemption your firm has been seeking does in fact apply to the northern segment, but not to the southern. I wrote the summary brief on that provision. If it would be helpful, I can get you a copy by Monday. He said this quietly. He said it clearly. He said it in German that was neither accented nor fumbling, but precise and unhurried. The German of someone who had spent 14 months being corrected by Berliners until the corrections stopped coming. Friedrich Bauer had gone very still, the kind of still that isn't calm at all. Everyone at the table was looking at Damien now. He straightened up. He kept his face exactly as it had been all evening. Professional, unhurried, present. "I apologize for the interruption," he said in English this time, to the table at large. "I'll let you get back to your dinner." He returned to his station. Bauer was the first to speak. He said something to his colleague in German, quickly, in a lower voice than he'd used all evening, and this time Damien noticed that he had lowered it. Old instinct kicking in, probably. The awareness, a little late, that the room had more ears than he'd accounted for. What he said was, "Who is that man?" His colleague didn't know. One of the local stakeholders, the one from the planning office, the one who had sat in the same floor of the building where Damien worked, was staring at him now with an expression that Damien could not quite read at first, and then could. It was recognition. Slow, slightly uncomfortable recognition. The kind that comes with the awareness of having passed someone in a hallway for 18 months, without seeing them. He had seen Damien at the planning office. He just hadn't known what he was looking at. The dinner wrapped up 40 minutes later. Damien cleared the dessert course, restacked the linens, returned the event materials to the service cart. He was changing back into his street clothes in the locker room when Carver came down and told him someone upstairs wanted to speak with him. He took his time lacing his boots. The someone was not Friedrich Bauer. Bauer had left with his Stuttgart colleagues, and Damien would not see him again that evening. And the thing he didn't do was spend much time thinking about what that man had thought or felt or concluded, because that was not really the part of the story that mattered to him. The someone was the stakeholder from the planning office. He was waiting in the hallway near the service entrance, jacket on, hands in his pockets, with the slightly sheepish posture of a man who isn't used to waiting in service corridors, but has decided it's appropriate to do it this once. His name was Mark Delacroix, Deputy Director, City Infrastructure Planning. Damien had been 2 floors below him for 18 months. "I didn't know you spoke German," Delacroix said. "No one asked," Damien said. Delacroix looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "You wrote the brief on the Riverside Corridor Amendment? I wrote the first 3 drafts. Someone else put their name on the final version." Another pause, the longer kind. "How long have you been with the office?" Delacroix asked. 3 years in February. Delacroix nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are recalculating something they thought was already calculated. "And the German," he said, was that Fulbright? Berlin?" Damien said. "Free university. Urban housing policy. I'm finishing a master's in urban economics on the side. University of Chicago, due in April." Delacroix blinked. Just once, but it was the kind of blink that means something. "On the side," he repeated. "On the side," Damien said. There's a version of this story where what comes next is immediate and cinematic. Where Delacroix pulls out a business card on the spot. Where Damien gets a promotion the following week. Where Friedrich Bauer sends a written apology and the universe folds into perfect moral geometry. That's not what happened, and Damien has never particularly wanted that version anyway, because it would miss the point. What happened was slower and more real than that. Delacroix asked if he could buy Damien a cup of coffee sometime that week to talk. Damien said yes. They met the following Tuesday at a diner on Michigan Avenue, the kind of place where the booths are cracked vinyl, and the coffee comes in a thick ceramic mug, and nobody looks at you sideways for taking up a table for 90 minutes. Delacroix asked him questions, real ones, the kind that show someone is paying attention, about the Riverside brief, about the master's thesis, about the specific intersection of infrastructure finance and zoning policy. that Damien had been quietly developing opinions about for 3 years in a corner chair that nobody else seemed to think of as a seat worth having. Damien answered all of them. 2 months later, he was moved to a different role at the planning office. Not a dramatic reclassification, just a reassignment, a shift from a team that processed applications to a team that actually developed policy. The kind of move that looks small from the outside and is not small at all. He still works banquet events sometimes. Fewer than before because the schedule is harder to manage now, but he hasn't stopped entirely. He's been asked why he keeps doing it by Delacroix once, almost as a joke, and Damien's answer was honest. Because it pays, and because it keeps him sharp, and because there is something useful about being in a room where nobody knows what you're carrying. You notice things from that position. You hear things people think are safe to say out loud. His thesis was submitted in April, 7 days before the deadline. His committee described the section on municipal infrastructure financing models in underserved corridors as, and this is a direct quote from the written assessment, unusually sophisticated for a candidate at this stage. He's read that phrase several times since then. He doesn't disagree. Friedrich Bauer's firm did not get the contract. This is a fact, not a point, and Damien does not claim credit for it. The decision went against Hausler and Brecht for reasons that had nothing to do with one Thursday evening in October. Reasons rooted in bid structure and compliance timelines, and the kind of bureaucratic detail that doesn't make for good storytelling but is how cities actually work. But Damien knows what Bauer said. He's always going to know what Bauer said. Not because it hurt him. He's past the part of his life where that particular category of cruelty lands cleanly. It takes a certain kind of exhaustion to get there, years of it, and he's done the mileage. But he knows because language is funny that way. It sticks. The things people say when they believe no one is listening, those have a way of living in a room, long after the speaker has left it. What Bauer didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the man refilling his water glass had spent a year in his country, learning its bureaucratic grammar, sitting in rooms not unlike that one, making himself useful in ways that took years to pay out. That the thing he was looking at when he looked at Damien was not what he thought he was looking at. That the silence in that room was not absence. It was preparation. Here is what Damien Holloway will tell you, if you ask him, which most people don't, that the hardest thing wasn't being underestimated. It was deciding, over and over again, that it wasn't worth correcting. That some rooms don't deserve your explanation. That patience is a skill. Same as language. Same as policy analysis. Same as knowing the municipal code number of a provision you wrote in the dark 6 months ago with no expectation that anyone would ever ask. You build the knowledge anyway. You carry it quietly. And sometimes on a Thursday evening in late October, when the room has gone still, and everyone is reaching for their water glasses, and nobody knows what to say next, you find out exactly what it was for.